It is amazing to me that, for the most part, it is leaders, tyrants from developing nations or from the so-called third world who from time to time find themselves deposed and sent to sit in little glass boxes in The Hague. And that may be entirely appropriate. They should have to pay for their looting and their corruption and their massacres of their own peoples as well as of others. I agree wholeheartedly. But then I wonder, why isn't President George W. Bush sitting in one of those glass boxes? Why isn't Henry Kissinger sitting in one of those glass boxes? These personages of the West have also been responsible for atrocities, have also been responsible for stimulating de facto genocides and exterminations of persons, and for overthrowing governments of one sort or another, or trying to overthrow governments of one sort or another around the world, basically breaking international law with impunity. And so I would ask my African brethren and sistren to consider striking themselves their own criminal court for historical crimes against humanity. I think that's really important because we shouldn't allow folks in The Hague who represent white supremacy, represent Western imperialism, to be the ones always running around the world pointing fingers at people about you're violating human rights, you're violating civil liberties, you are bad, you are evil. We are going to be the people who teach you a lesson, who bring you to justice, who force you to atone for your crimes and your sins, execute you, punish you, incarcerate you, whatever. And I think that developing nations, I think that the peoples of Asia and Africa and South America and Oceania need to put together our own criminal court with international reach, with our own judges applying UN regulations about who's responsible whenever war crimes or genocides take place, or whenever illegal acts against sovereign nations take place, especially when it's a Western nation against a non-Western nation. We need to have our own international criminal court to call those villains to account and to ask that their nations send them to, I don't know, our own version of The Hague. Maybe it's going to be in Cairo. Maybe it's going to be in Johannesburg. I don't know. But wherever it is, we should have the power to ask guilty nations led by guilty leaders to send their leaders to our own little glass boxes for them to inhabit. And then we might have a fairer system of international justice, and it might be less likely that richer nations will run roughshod over poorer nations while arguing the whole time that it's about uplifting or protecting or defending human rights. That's just one thing. So I want to put that on the table. Let's have our own international criminal court for present and historical crimes against humanity. No one should be able to say that they are allowed to keep their ill-gotten gains, like Belgium, for instance, from the what was then the Belgian Congo, by saying, well, that was then, it's all over. It's, the great-great-great-grandfathers committed all these crimes in the Belgian Congo, lopping off people's limbs, stealing the diamonds and the rubber and cocoa and everything, and still trying to orchestrate things behind the scenes in terms of overthrowing Nkrumah, for instance, in the 1960s. And we need to be able to call those empires, former empires, and their constituent powers to account today, because part of the wealth that they enjoy today was gained by essentially raping and pillaging Asia, South America, the Americas in general, and Africa. And we shouldn't pretend that just because it happened a century ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, that there's some kind of statute of limitations that has come to pass where we cannot talk about those past crimes, because the proceeds of those past crimes are still making the descendants of the criminals rich and making them feel justified in holding on to their riches and then trying to pontificate to others who are still poor that it's their fault that they're poor. It's because they're lazy. It's because they're corrupt. I think that we would have a much better world system if, in fact, along with that international court I've been discussing, that we actually put up a hue and cry that is indomitable, demanding reparations. The very idea that Western nations, again, white supremacist in history, and still today, white supremacist in attitude, that Western nations have the nerve to suggest that they don't have to answer for the transatlantic slave trade. They don't have to answer for depopulation of Africa. They don't have to answer for the warping of African economies and divisions of African peoples in order to make themselves extremely rich. And then to sit on that pile of gold and ivory, to sit on top of those heaps of uranium and cobalt and chrome and oil and say, oh, it's your fault that you are not as grandiosely rich and as militarily or earth-shattering as we are, even though we looted you and pillaged you for centuries. And we're going to turn around and preach to you about human rights and civil liberties that we don't respect. Ask any indigenous person in Canada. Ask any black person in North America how much civil liberties, how much human rights we actually enjoy when we step outside of our homes or step outside of our apartments or step into our cars. Yes, we may have a good standard of living, but it doesn't mean that we are allowed to live our lives as citizens in these democracies without being harassed to no end, almost from cradle to grave, by ignorant police and security guards and so on, who are hell-bent on making us feel bad about being black when we only feel pride and only try to exercise our rights to go where we should be able to go, so long as it's public property, to be able to buy where we can afford to spend, be able to buy where we can actually be allowed to work. And so all this, I know I'm taking a lot of time to say all this stuff, but I'm also asking us to look through all of the bafflegab, to look through all of the propaganda. And we get propagandized all the time to think that certain nations are really good and always meant the best for everybody, no matter what, while other nations are to be demonized and disrespected and dissed and so on as being failed states and as being populated by second-rate examples of humanity. I think that we need to understand that the way that the world took shape, first in 1492, and then in the Berlin conferences of 1884 and 1885, and then in the post-war conferences of World War I and World War II, and especially World War II, are responsible for the colonizations, for the severe extractions of human beings and labor and resources from countries that found themselves saddled with the white supremacist, unashamedly, unabashedly white supremacist imperialist superstructure that was obvious and blatant about, we are oppressing you because you are people of color. You are less than human. So we feel we have a God-given right to take whatever we want from you, to do whatever we want to you, and you have no right to complain because we are bringing civilization, we are bringing Christianity. All you have to bring to us is your labor power and, of course, the resources that you will thank us tremendously for allowing us or letting us exploit the hell out of your God-given resources. So I say all this to try to push us to be constantly critical of the propaganda that we receive, to ask that we be extremely informed about our histories, to demand reparations for slavery, to demand reparation. I mean, you've got to think, what was slavery? What slavery was not just exploitation of labor without pay, without any kind of compensation. It also entailed the smashing of families. It entailed the smashing of nations. This was a crime against humanity. I don't care that 500 years have gone by. I don't care. It is still a crime against humanity that has never actually been, where those responsible have never actually been called to account. And then they have the nerve to talk about other people being violators of human rights and civil liberties. I don't believe that anyone in the West has any right to talk about crimes being committed by anybody else until they atone for their crimes against indigenous people and against African peoples brought here against their will to make them rich. And, okay, I'm not a theorist of global politics, but I am a student of history. And I just do not understand how anyone can overlook the